In this session, we are going to add security to our application. Spring Security will be taken up itself as a module and expanded upon on an upcoming session. But in this short video, my intention is to make the audience understand the similarities in configuration of the different modules of Spring. So as you can see, here you can see the web config, which was the configuration details of Spring MVC. So the first thing that we are going to do is to add the security. So I have already added the Spring Security dependencies here. So the same version I am using, the two dependencies that are required, Spring Security config and the Spring Security web. And how did I come to know about that? Of course, by referring the Spring Security reference PDF file. So you can see the minimal Spring Security Maven set of dependencies typically looks like this. So I just copied and pasted the same version I am using. So that's the version I have copied it here. So these two dependencies are required for giving security to your Spring MVC application. Step 2. We are going to create the configuration for Spring Security. But before we go into that, if you look at the web config that was created for Spring MVC configuration, you can see the configuration at enable web MVC, these annotations. So again, I am reiterating why we are giving a small introduction to Spring Security is to make you understand the similarities in configuration. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a new Java class. I will give the name security config. Just as we did with web config, the same configuration is given here if you need any beans to be defined here, or else this is not required. Then at enable web security. So see, when in the web config we were using enable web MVC, that was the annotation that gave us a lot of functionality out of the box. Similarly, by giving a new class, creating a new class and enable web security is the starting point of configuring our Spring Security. Again, going back to our discussion to the Spring MVC, if you look at the one of the sessions, if you want to add or override the defaults provided by this particular enable web MVC, if you remember theory, we extend this class with web MVC configurer adapter. And then what we do, we will override the methods in this MVC like configure path, configure content negotiation. Going below, you can add formatters, you can add interceptors, resource handlers, all these things. You can create new view handlers and all the stuff. Okay, we are not going into that for the time being. So what I wanted to tell you, so here in our previous session, we never extended from the web MVC configurer adapter, because we were satisfied with the default configurations. But here in the security configuration, we need to add a add the user credentials. So what we are going to do, we are going to extend this from web security configurer adapter. And then what we do, we will override the configure authentication manager builder method. Again, those who are new to security may not understand what we are doing here. Again, I am reiterating, we will be taking Spring Security in detail in some other course. Here my intention is to just add a security to our minimal application that was created by Spring Tool Suite, and to compare the similarities in configuration of the different modules. So two modules we are using here. One is the Spring MVC module, and you saw how the configuration is done. Again, In the previous video I told you this web config is a replacement of the bean definition XML file. Similarly, this security config, whatever the beans are required for giving security to your application, all these beans has to be declared in an XML file. Almost always we'll be using the same XML file, so this can be considered as a replacement of the XML file for Spring Security. So in this particular class, because we are extending from the web security configure adapter, again, if you don't understand, don't worry, we will talk about this extensively in some later sessions. My intention is to create an in-memory users with, so I'm just going to create just a single user with the name user dot password. Maybe I can give some roles too. I give users as roles, and I think that's it. So what we just did here is that we overrode the web security configurer adapter and then overrode the configure method, and using the authentication manager builder. Again, to learn Spring in detail, you need to know about different design patterns available. One of the design patterns is the builder pattern. So using this builder pattern, which is the authentication manager builder, which is used to create an authentication manager. There are different types of authentication managers, but we are not going into the detail as of now. Here I am using an in-memory authentication manager, creating an in-memory authentication manager with a single user, with the user and the password, and his roles is user. Anyway, we are not going to use any of these roles. So that is the step 1 of creating your configuration. So what effectively this particular class does is that it will, what exactly this does is that this configuration will create a servlet filter known as the Spring Security Filter Chain. The exact name is the delegating filter proxy, which actually delegates the request to a a chain of filters and all. But again, we won't be discussing those things right now. So what we are doing here is that this particular configuration creates a servlet filter known as the Spring Security Filter Chain. So what we need to do, this particular configuration just creates a filter only. We need to register that particular filter with the application. So what we have to do, we have to create another class. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create another class. I will give the name security initializer. So again, have you seen the web application initializer? At that time I told you this web app initializer is a replacement of the web.xml file where we are going to define a dispatcher servlet. Okay, and this was the replacement of the XML file. Similarly, the security, so what we just did, we created a security filter or servlet filter for our application for security purposes using this configuration, and you need to register this particular filter with the application. Because we don't have a web.xml file, we are going to create another class, and what we are going to do, this is also based on the documentation that we are going to extend from abstract security web application initializer. That's all we actually need to do. From a Java programmer perspective, this class with no methods or code is kind of an looking awkward, but because we don't have a web.xml file and that we have to register the filter with the web.xml file or with the application, we have to have this code. And the last thing that we are going to do is that, of course, we need to register this particular security config with the application context. So we already have an application context here. This web config is the application context which was passed in along with the web application initializer. So you remember? So this web app initializer is the replacement of web.xml file where we have passed in the bean definition for Spring MVC. Similarly, we are going to pass the security definition too. That's all there is to it. Now the application is complete. So again, I'm going from step 1 of what we did for introducing security. Step 1, into the POM file, we added the dependency, the required dependencies for giving security to Spring MVC application. Step 2, we created a security config, gave the annotation and configuration and enable web security. To create the users that is going to be logging to the application, we extended from the web security configure adapter and overrode the configure method, where we are using the builder pattern to create an authentication manager instance, in this case an in-memory authentication manager with a single user. So again, this configuration creates a filter, a servlet filter, which has to be registered with the application. So we created a security initializer. We have to have this no methods Java class to register that particular security filter. And the last thing that we have to do, we need to introduce those beans created by the security config into the web application context. So we already have the web application initializer which creates the web application context for us. So we add the security config, those filters, those beans that is required for Spring security added to the web application context. So now that is done, we have done coding. So just see, I haven't specified any other configuration details. So one thing you should understand, by just extending from web security configurer adapter, your whole application is secured by default. Why I am telling this now? When we come to a SpringBoot, you will see that by just including one starter POM into the Maven, the whole application is secured by default. But nothing magic is happening behind the scenes. Everything is because of the presence of some of the annotations like enable web security, which gets detected automatically and security is applied to it. Because we are not dealing with Spring Boot here. This is a Spring MVC application using the Spring framework and not Spring Boot. We have to do it manually using the code, and that's what we just did here. I hope you are getting me. Now what we are going to do, that's all with the application. So this particular configuration means the whole application. That means there is only one. If you remember, I have the home controller. I am not giving any particular. You can definitely give a lot of security based on the roles and all. That is not our intention right now. So let us deploy the application and see what happens based on this configuration that we have given. So I am going to, I think it is already synchronized. I'm going to start the application and see whether the application is secured or not. So let me see whether it is still booting it. Maybe I should delete some of the existing applications from the deployment directory. That's why it is taking some time, so bear with me. Now of course it has started. So you can see, instead of we seeing the home page, we are redirecting to a form-based login where I am going to give the username, user, and the password provided, that is the password itself. I am going to log in. if everything goes well, I will be directed to the home page. Now you can see, because that means based on this particular security, okay, based on this particular security configuration, the whole application is secured. That means we have only one endpoint, that is the root context, which goes to the home method. This particular method itself is secured. Every URL to this application is secured by default. So what I wanted to tell you here is that if you know this much about the configuration details of Spring MVC as well as Spring Security, getting to know the other modules is not a big deal. For example, if you want to start with transaction management, or if you want to give a caching, so there are similar annotations present in Spring modules, like enable, apart, keep the web security apart. You will have enable transactions, enable caching, and all the stuff which is used by SpringBoot internally. So hope you got what the Spring security aspect is all about, as a brief. But of course, there is a lot of things happening behind the scenes. We will elaborate in some other session. Okay, so thanks for now.